You have probably had a version of this conversation before. Someone mentions a drug on the news. Someone else says it's the worst one. Everyone nods. Nobody checks. You have a picture in your head of the most dangerous drug on earth, and it probably has a needle in it, or a pipe, or a name that sounds illegal. But the real answer is far stranger. It is sitting in your fridge. It is on a shelf at your local store. It is legal in almost every country you could name. And for decades, the actual science on this question has been buried under moral panic, media noise, and the simple fact that dangerous is not the same thing as illegal. So what does danger actually mean, scientifically? Not vibes. Not headlines. Numbers. In 2010, a British psychiatrist named David Nutt did something almost nobody had done before. He gathered a panel of addiction experts, toxicologists, and forensic scientists, and asked them to rank 20 common drugs using actual criteria. Not public opinion. Not legal status. Real measurable harm. They looked at 3 categories. Physical harm to the user. The drug's addictive potential. And the harm it causes to other people, not just the person taking it. Family breakdown, crime, violence, the ripple effects that spread outward from a single choice. The study was published in the Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals in the world. And the results made a lot of people extremely uncomfortable. You might expect heroin to top the list. It's close, but it's not first. You might expect crack cocaine. Also high, also not first. The single most dangerous drug, when you weigh harm to the user and harm to everyone around them, was alcohol. Not a rare synthetic compound cooked in a lab. Not something smuggled across a border in the dead of night. A drink you can buy at a gas station. Let that sit for a second. Why? Before we get to the why, look closer at how the study actually worked, because the method matters. Nutt's panel didn't just guess. They scored each of 16 harm criteria on a scale from 0 to 100, weighted by real-world evidence. Mortality risk. The likelihood of dependency after repeated use. Damage to mental function. Economic cost to healthcare systems. Cost to family units. Cost to communities through crime linked to acquisition and use. Every criterion got tallied, weighted, and combined into a single composite score. Heroin scored around 55. Crack cocaine scored close behind. Alcohol scored 72. Almost 20 points clear of anything else on the list. Tobacco landed in the middle of the pack, more harmful than cannabis, ecstasy, or LSD, all 3 of which sat near the bottom of the entire ranking, far below what public perception would predict. Here is where the deep dive gets interesting, because the reasons are not what you'd guess. Heroin and crack cause devastating harm, but mostly to the person using them. Alcohol spreads its damage sideways. Domestic violence. Drunk driving deaths. Emergency room visits from bar fights that had nothing to do with the 2 people actually fighting. Liver disease that takes decades to kill you, quietly, while you keep functioning at work every single day. Alcohol doesn't need to be the most addictive substance to be the most destructive. It just needs to be everywhere. And it is everywhere. That's the second layer of this story, the one that's almost more important than the ranking itself. Availability changes everything about how we perceive risk. Think about how your brain actually processes danger. Your ancestors didn't evolve to calculate statistics. They evolved to react to what was rare, sudden, and visible. A snake in tall grass triggers instant fear, because a snake bite in the wrong environment could kill you in an afternoon. But a slow accumulation of liver damage over 20 years. Your brain barely registers it as a threat at all. There's no adrenaline spike for cirrhosis. There's no fight-or-flight response to a habit that develops one ordinary evening at a time. This is a concept researchers call availability bias, closely tied to what psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman described in their work on risk perception back in the 1970s. Their research showed something uncomfortable about the human mind. We don't rank danger by actual statistical likelihood. We rank it by how easily we can picture it happening, how vivid and dramatic the image is. A plane crash feels more dangerous than a car crash, even though you are statistically far safer on a commercial flight than on the highway to the airport. A shark attack feels terrifying, even though you are more likely to be killed by a vending machine falling on you. Vividness beats statistics, every single time, in the ancient wiring of your brain. Picture a public health campaign from the 1980s. A single egg, cracked into a sizzling frying pan. A stern voice says, "This is your brain on drugs." It ran constantly. It became a cultural touchstone. It was also, according to later reviews of drug education programs, almost completely ineffective at reducing actual use, because it relied on fear rather than accurate information, and teenagers, of all people, are remarkably good at detecting when an authority figure is exaggerating. Studies tracking the DARE program, one of the most widely distributed school drug prevention curriculums in American history, found essentially no measurable long-term reduction in substance use among the students who went through it. Some researchers even found the opposite effect in certain groups, a slight increase in curiosity. Fear-based messaging captured attention. It did not change behavior, and it definitely did not communicate an accurate hierarchy of actual risk. So when a drug is legal, familiar, sold in bright packaging, advertised during football games, handed to you at a wedding toast, your brain stops flagging it as a threat. It becomes wallpaper. Background noise. Normal. Meanwhile, a drug that's illegal, whispered about, associated with crime and back alleys, gets flagged as maximally dangerous, regardless of what the actual toxicology says. Here's the twist that makes this even stranger. It's not really about the chemical at all. It's about context. There's a famous set of experiments from the late 1970s, run by a Canadian psychologist named Bruce Alexander, that changed how scientists think about addiction itself. Alexander noticed that most addiction research at the time isolated a single rat in a small cage with 2 water bottles, one plain, one laced with a drug. Unsurprisingly, the isolated rat would often drink itself into oblivion. It became the textbook proof that drugs simply hijack the brain, no matter what. But Alexander suspected something was missing. So he built something different. Researchers now call it Rat Park. A large, colorful enclosure with other rats to socialize with, tunnels to explore, wheels to run on, actual rat community. Same 2 water bottles, same drugged option available at all times. And the rats in Rat Park barely touched it. Even rats that had already been made dependent, when moved from an isolation cage into Rat Park, cut their drug use dramatically. What does that tell you? It suggests addiction isn't purely a chemical hostage situation happening inside your skull. It's also a response to isolation, to environment, to what else is available to fill the same need. The most dangerous drug might not just be a substance. It might be the absence of connection that makes any substance feel necessary in the first place. Now here's where the science gets even more counterintuitive. Nutt's research and multiple follow-up studies have pointed to something that should reframe how you think about the entire concept of drug danger. Tobacco, another completely legal substance, kills more people worldwide every single year than nearly every illegal drug combined. The World Health Organization has tracked this for decades. Millions of deaths annually, not from overdose, not from a single dramatic night, but from the slow, patient, decades-long grind of cardiovascular disease and cancer. Nobody clutches their pearls at a gas station selling cigarettes. It's just Tuesday. Compare that scale to something that dominates headlines instead. Fentanyl-related overdoses have risen sharply in recent years, and the harm is real, immediate, and worth every ounce of public concern it receives. But when researchers compare total annual deaths across all substances, tobacco's toll still dwarfs it, year after year, decade after decade, because the damage is spread across a population so large it stops feeling like a crisis and starts feeling like background weather. A single dramatic overdose makes the news. A cardiologist quietly telling a 60-year-old patient that decades of smoking finally caught up with their arteries does not. So why does the label illegal feel so much scarier than the label legal, when the data often points the opposite direction? Part of the answer traces back almost a century, to decisions that had very little to do with pharmacology and a lot to do with politics, race, and economics. Many of the substances that are criminalized today were criminalized not purely because of measured harm, but because of who was using them, or which industries stood to lose money if a competing substance gained popularity. Historians studying early 20th century drug policy have documented how alcohol prohibition was eventually repealed partly due to enormous public and economic pressure, while other substances, associated with marginalized communities, never got the same reconsideration. The chemistry didn't change. The politics did. Look at the timeline closely and the pattern becomes almost impossible to unsee. In the early 1900s, cocaine and opium derivatives were legal, unregulated, and openly sold in general stores and mail-order catalogs, marketed as tonics for everything from teething babies to fatigue. It was only as immigration patterns shifted, and as certain substances became associated with specific ethnic communities in the public imagination, that legislation began targeting those substances specifically. Historians of drug policy have traced how early 20th century opium laws in the United States were explicitly tied, in the language of the lawmakers themselves, to anxiety about Chinese immigrant communities, while cocaine restrictions were tied to similar anxieties about black communities in the South. Alcohol, overwhelmingly associated with European immigrant and long-established communities, took a different path entirely. It was banned nationally in 1920, and the experiment collapsed within 13 years, not because new science proved it was safer, but because prohibition created a massive underground economy, funded organized crime on a historic scale, and proved wildly unpopular with the very voters lawmakers depended on. It was repealed in 1933, and alcohol was folded back into ordinary commercial life so completely that most people alive today have never once thought of it as a banned substance that had to fight its way back to legality. That history matters here because it shows danger rankings were never purely scientific to begin with. They were built, brick by brick, out of whichever substances happened to have political power and cultural majority behind them at the moment the laws were written. The substances with the most effective lobbying, the deepest cultural roots, and the least association with marginalized groups ended up on the legal side of the line, regardless of what a toxicology report might have said if anyone had actually consulted one. This is the part of the story that turns the whole question inside out. You started this thinking the answer would be a specific molecule. Something exotic. Something with a menacing name. But the science keeps pointing somewhere else entirely. Danger, it turns out, is not a fixed property of a chemical. It is a relationship between a substance, a dose, a person's environment, and a society's tolerance for the harm that substance causes. Consider caffeine for a moment, since you probably had some this morning. In large enough doses, caffeine can be lethal. But you don't fear your coffee, because the dose you consume is nowhere near that threshold, and because caffeine is so deeply woven into daily ritual that it barely registers as a drug at all. Compare that to a substance you've never tried, something you only know through news headlines. Your fear of it has almost nothing to do with its actual lethal dose and almost everything to do with how unfamiliar and dramatized its portrayal has been. Or consider a class of medication sitting in millions of medicine cabinets right now, prescribed by an actual doctor, picked up at an actual pharmacy. Benzodiazepines, the family of drugs that includes common anti-anxiety medications, carry a real and well-documented risk of physical dependency, and combined with alcohol they become significantly more dangerous, sometimes fatally so. Yet because a doctor's signature is attached, the substance inherits an aura of safety that street drugs never get, even when the pharmacological risk profile, in certain combinations, rivals or exceeds substances carrying far heavier social stigma. The prescription pad functions almost like a cultural permission slip, quietly reclassifying risk in the public mind without changing a single molecule of the compound itself. None of this is an argument that every drug is equally safe, because that's not what the data shows either. Some substances genuinely carry a much higher risk of fatal overdose in a single use, and that risk is real and worth taking seriously. But the ranking of danger, when you strip away the moral panic and look purely at aggregate harm across millions of people over decades, keeps circling back to the substances hiding in plain sight. The ones with lobbying budgets. The ones with commercials. The ones served at your cousin's wedding. This is also why later research, including a broader 2010 comparison led by the same team and published alongside international collaborators, kept reaching similar conclusions across different countries with different legal systems. The specific substances at the top of the list shifted slightly depending on cultural context, but the underlying finding held steady. Legal status and scientific harm rarely lined up the way most people assumed they would. A drug's position in the law told you far more about a country's history, economics, and cultural comfort than it told you about the actual chemistry sitting inside the bottle, the pack, or the pill. Here is the modern mirror, the part of this that isn't really about history or lab experiments at all. It's about you, right now, and the substances already sitting in your own routine. Maybe it's the wine you have most nights to unwind. Maybe it's the vape you tell yourself you'll quit next month. Maybe it's nothing at all, and this whole conversation feels distant. But somewhere in your life, there is probably a substance you've stopped seeing clearly, because it's familiar, because it's legal, because everyone around you treats it as normal. That familiarity is exactly the mechanism the research keeps circling back to. Not the drug's chemistry. Your relationship to how visible its danger actually is. Think about how many rituals in your week already involve a substance you've never once labeled as one. The coffee that starts your morning, the glass poured the moment a stressful week ends, the after-dinner cigarette a relative still swears helps them think. None of these moments feel like drug use, because the word drug has been culturally reserved for the unfamiliar, the illegal, the things that happen to other people in other neighborhoods. But your liver doesn't know the difference between a substance with a street name and a substance with a marketing budget. Your dopamine system responds to habitual reward the same way whether the bottle has a warning label in tiny print or a mugshot on the evening news. And think about Rat Park again, because it applies to more than laboratory rodents. The environments you build for yourself, the friendships you maintain, the sense of purpose you wake up with, all of it shapes how much pull any given substance has over you. Alexander's research suggested that isolation itself functions almost like a drug precursor, priming the brain to reach for anything that offers relief. If that's true, then the most protective thing you can build in your own life isn't willpower. It's connection. It's a version of Rat Park you construct for yourself, one relationship and one meaningful routine at a time. Ask yourself honestly, the next time you reach for whatever your version of this is, are you evaluating the actual risk, based on how it affects your body over time, how it affects the people around you, how it fits into your environment and your relationships? Or are you running on the same ancient wiring that flags snakes and ignores slow damage, the same bias Kahneman and Tversky spent their careers mapping out? You don't need to overhaul your entire life after watching a video. Nobody expects that, least of all the researchers whose careers were built on decades of careful, unglamorous data collection rather than viral moments. But awareness itself is worth something. The next time a headline tries to hand you a villain, a single scary molecule to fear, ask what the actual numbers say before you accept the story. Ask who benefits from you fearing one substance while ignoring another sitting quietly on the shelf beside it. Ask whether your own habits would survive the same scrutiny you're so quick to apply to someone else's. Because that's the real, unglamorous, uncomfortable answer science keeps arriving at. The most dangerous drug was never hiding in a back alley. It was never something you needed a dealer to find. It has been standing in plain sight the entire time, quietly normalized, sold with a smile, and functioning as a completely ordinary part of daily life. You have probably had a version of this conversation before. Now you know why nobody checked. And now, the next time it comes up in conversation, you're the one who finally does. Not because you memorized a scary fact. Because you looked past the fear, straight at the evidence, and stayed there long enough to actually see it.